Good evening. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director, and Peter J. Sharp, Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. Welcome to this last episode of Cocktails with a Curator. Thank you for joining us for over a year, over 65 episodes of this program. This last episode is dedicated to this great portrait by Whistler at the Frick. It is entitled Arrangement in Black and Gold, Comte Robert de Montesquieu Fezensac. And it is one of the most iconic works by Whistler at the Frick, and a very celebrated one of a very interesting and eccentric character. We started Cocktails with a Curator with an iconic drink, an iconic cocktail, which was a Manhattan, in honor of the island in which the Frick Collection is located and in which I live. And I would like to finish the series with another Manhattan. And this, in honor of this painting, is a spin-off of a traditional Manhattan, and it's called a Black Manhattan. Instead of sweet vermouth, it is with Amaro, which is an Italian, very bitter, digestive drink. I am mixing it today with Amaro Averna, which was invented by the Averna family in the 1880s in Sicily, in Italy. But there are a number of different Amari that you can try and mix with rye for your Black Manhattan. Another very celebrated one in Italy is Cynar, which is actually made with artichokes. So I raise my glass to Whistler and to the Comte de Montesquieu, and to all of you who have followed us over the past year, and of course to Manhattan and the Frick Collection. Cheers. The small painting by Cimabue at the Frick is the oldest work of art at the Frick, painted probably in the 1280s in Pisa in Tuscany. The Frick is a collection mostly of European works of art. That is the center of the collection. But in fact, there are a few exceptions. And we've looked at some of these exceptions during Cocktails with a Curator. But the vast majority of the collection is European paintings from the 13th century, we say, to the 19th, early 20th century. So if this is the oldest object at the Frick, what is the most modern, the most recently made object at the Frick? And this, in fact, is quite difficult to pinpoint exactly. A number of family portraits, of course, of Frick and his family were produced even after Frick died. So this is the marble bust by Malvina Hoffman, which was carved in the 1920s after Frick died in 1919. And of course, this could count as one of the more modern works in the collection. Another sculpture is probably the most modern object that we have as a works of art, and it's this bronze sculpture of a whippet by Catherine Ward Lane Weems. Beautiful sort of Art Deco work of art, which is actually usually in storage, but it was a gift from a family member to the Frick in the 1970s. We haven't covered this in Cocktails with a Curator, but if you want to know something more about it, my canine colleague, Milou, gave an episode of the other version of Cocktails with a Curator on this wonderful sculpture, and I encourage you all to look that up. Most people would imagine that the most modern works of the Frick are the Impressionist works that Frick acquired, in fact, at different times of his life. He bought another painting by Monet much earlier than the date when this entered the collection. And in fact, Frick really started his career as a collector of what was then contemporary art, mostly French. Most of those works, all of those works effectively, are now at the Frick in Pittsburgh. So we really present at the Frick Collection the Old Masters Collection, which was assembled from the late 19th century up to Frick's death in 1919. Frick Madison, in fact, ends its geographical and chronological approach with Impressionism. And we have three paintings by Monet, Degas, and Renoir, which date all from around the same time, the second half of the 1870s. But technically, these are not the more modern works that we're exhibiting at Frick Madison. And the most modern works are actually the works by an American artist, by Whistler. Whistler was born in America, but spent all of his life in Europe, between London mostly and Paris. And the Frick has a very important collection of works by Whistler. So even though we are a collection of European paintings, and even though these paintings were in fact painted and produced in Europe, and they represent European sitters, they are by an American artist. And Whistler is an exception in a number of ways at the Frick. People would be surprised to know that Whistler is the best represented artist at the Frick. We have 20 works by Whistler, which were all acquired by Henry Clay Frick, mostly in the 19-teens. And these are 4 spectacular full-length portraits, 2 black, 2 pink, a landscape that he painted while he was in Chile in the 1860s, and a set of 12 etchings of Venice, which Frick bought in block, and 3 beautiful pastels of Venice. So we have a total of 20 works of art by Whistler. He's the best represented artist across different media at the Frick. The other extraordinary thing about the Whistlers at the Frick is that because they were acquired soon after the artist had died, and often from the heirs of the people who these portraits were painted for, or sometimes with very few passages in between. These are works that are incredibly well preserved. One of them, the one on the left of Lady Mew, is also unlined, and they all have their original frames designed by Whistler himself. Most of the frame at the Frick, and this is particularly visible now at Frick Madison, are grand French-style frames that were put on the pictures by Frick and by the dealers who sold the paintings to him. These are the only ones that really consistently maintain their original frames designed by the artist, and that is particularly exceptional. Here you see 3 of the 4 portraits as they're displayed at Frick Madison, and the Comte de Montesquieu is on the right. Here you see him again in the usual display in the Oval Room at 1 East 70th Street. So who was Robert de Montesquieu Fezensac? He was older than Frick, but in fact he died a few years after Frick died. He was born in 1855 and died in 1921. He was an aristocrat, but also a man of letters, an aesthete, an arbiter of taste, one could say, in Paris at the turn of the century. He was a very eccentric man, and a descendant of a particularly prominent aristocratic family in Paris, which claimed descent through a dynasty that went all the way back to the Merovingian period. And Montesquieu had a number of famous ancestors, including D'Artagnan, one of the 3 Musketeers. He claimed descent from him. And also one of the governess of the King of Rome, Napoleon's son, was also an ancestor of Montesquieu. Montesquieu, as a young man, became well known in Paris for his poetry, but also for his particularly eccentric taste. He came from a numerous family, but by 1883, as a very young man, his mother and his older brothers had all died. And so he inherited the title. And this was combined with a very difficult relationship with his father. And Montesquieu led a sort of separate life from his father without being particularly close to him. And through a substantial fortune that he inherited and had, managed to spend a very lavish life, which often later in life, because of his extravagant taste, led to the need of money. I mean, he spent way more than what he had, which was already a substantial amount. He was a famous figure in Paris for his eccentric clothes, his eccentric taste, and someone who was particularly interested in contemporary art, but also in a number of other forms of art, especially art from Asia. And all of this can be seen in photos that were produced at the time. Here he is posing in a number of theatrical poses, as on the left, the beheaded head of John the Baptist set against an Asian carpet, but also over a William Morris fabric. And this is one of his many houses. He moved a number of times, and all of his residences were known for this extraordinary combination of contemporary Parisian works of art with Asian art. And here you can see one of his early apartments, his bedroom, and how eccentric this was. The most famous of these houses was the pavilion that he renamed the Pavilion Montesquieu, and which was at Versailles, and he lived there for a substantial amount of time, moving then to a number of other residences in and outside of Paris. In 1885, Montesquieu meets a young Argentinian man, Gabriel Iturri, and the two start a relationship which will last 20 years. Iturri is officially Montesquieu's secretary, but of course, everyone knows at the time that the two are a couple. And there are a series of wonderful photos of the two of them together. Here you see them in this very witty photo in which you see them switching places. So on the left, you see Montesquieu from the front and Iturri from the back, and then they swap positions on the right. They were caricatured a number of times at the time, and here they are, Montesquieu on the left. And they were a very well-known couple in Paris at the time, really spending time with writers and artists and the kind of intelligentsia of the time in Paris, and the more bohemian side, let's say, of the aristocracy. The two were buried together in the cemetery at Versailles, which was also pretty surprising and shocking for the time. And here you see the grave, which was designed by Montesquieu when Iturri died. As I say, they were together for 20 years until 1905, when Iturri died, and Montesquieu survived him about more than a decade, dying himself in 1921 and then being buried in the same grave. The statue, which they believe to be an old statue, but it's probably a 19th century one in lead, is the so-called Angel of Silence. And it is a statue that Iturri had found in a chateau and particularly liked. And later on, when Iturri died, Montesquieu bought it and made it the center of this monument, which also, interestingly enough, does not name either of them anywhere. It's a very plain tomb with just this extraordinary statue on top of it. Montesquieu meets Whistler in 1885. So it's actually the same year when he meets his partner, Iturri. And Montesquieu and Whistler meet in London we have the exact date, on the 3rd of July, 1885, at the Reform Club, a private gentleman's club in London. And the introduction is arranged by Henry James, the writer. The two become fast friends, and Montesquieu becomes particularly interested in Whistler's art and start collecting works by Whistler, especially etchings and drawings. Whistler at the time was a very famous artist. He was more than 20 years older than Montesquieu. And of course, he had already painted some of his very famous works in the 1870s in London. He had produced great portraits like this symphony in flesh color and pink, the portrait of Mrs. Leyland, also at the Frick, which was painted between 1871 and 74. And only a few years later, in 1876, for the Leylands, he had decorated their dining room at Prince's Gate in London, which of course is the celebrated Peacock Room, which was subsequently acquired by Freer, an American collector who moved it to Detroit and then eventually to Washington, D.C., where it is now at the Freer Art Gallery. In 1880, after a famous trial and bankruptcy, Whistler moves to Venice and produces a series of these wonderful views of Venice and etchings and pastels. The ones at the Frick, the etchings, the 12 etchings and the 3 pastels are all of Venice from this period. And these are the type of paintings that attract Montesquieu. And Montesquieu described Whistler's art as an art that is made out of mystery, mist, and air. Very appropriate when you think of works like this one. They meet in 1885, but it's not until 1891 that Montesquieu sits for Whistler. 1891 to 1892 is the date when this portrait is painted. And this makes it the most recent of the Whistlers we own at the Frick, and therefore the most modern work of art on display at Frick Madison currently, and also probably usually at the Frick Collection of 70th Street. Montesquieu sits for Whistler on a number of occasions, first in London during a trip to London in 1891, and subsequently in Paris. Whistler comes to Paris in 1892 with the portrait, and Montesquieu sits for him for a longer period of time then. And the portrait is then exhibited before it's given to Montesquieu in 1894 in Paris. The Count is shown looking at the viewer, even though both the Count and the Count's cousin, Countess Grefful, who was a great society lady at the time, suggested to Whistler that the portrait should have been in profile. But Whistler, of course, followed his own ideas and portrays him sort of looking out at the viewer, holding a cane in his right hand, and on the left, holding this cape, this gray cape. Both objects had a certain significance for Montesquieu. We will see that he was particularly fond of canes. He was involved in a very unpleasant episode to do with a cane when there was a very tragic event in Paris when a fire broke in a charity site, the Bazar de la Charité. More than 140 people died in this fire, mostly women from the aristocracy who were there performing charitable acts of some kind or another. And it was said at the time that many men sort of fought their way out of this place on fire with their canes. A few days later, Montesquieu was visiting some friends, and someone saw him with a cane and made a comment as if to suggest that he was one of these men at the Bazar de la Charité. Of course, Montesquieu was at home that day. He wasn't physically there, but he asked for a duel. He asked for satisfaction, and a duel was fought. Montesquieu was somewhat wounded, but of course, his honor came out intact. So the cane, of course, is an object linked to Montesquieu, but also linked to a number of unpleasant episodes. The cape was actually not his, and actually belonged to his cousin, to the Comtesse de Grefful. And this is actually a female vestment, a female piece of clothing, and it is a chinchilla fur coat, which apparently the Comtesse lent to Montesquieu for the sitting, for this portrait, to add a different color to the symphony of grays, to the arrangement of blacks that Whistler had painted. So adding some gray to the blacks. Also, very curiously, there are references to the fact that the fur coat was rather heavy, and Montesquieu got very tired of sort of holding it on his arm. Next to Montesquieu's right hand and the cane is this butterfly symbol, which is the symbol of Whistler. Whistler signed his paintings and etchings with a butterfly. Montesquieu instead associated himself to the bat, and his symbol was the bat. His house was filled with decorations of bats, and they were referred to as the bat and the butterfly. The painting was displayed in Montesquieu's house, and here you see in this rather poor quality photo one of his houses. This is his house at the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, and next to this very grand fireplace, you can see just about on the right a framed picture in a gold frame on an easel, and that, of course, is the Whistler portrait. At the same time, Whistler was planning to do a second portrait of Montesquieu in gray. And it is unclear what happened to this portrait. We know that it was started, but it seems from the evidence we have that Whistler was not happy with it and ended up either painting over it or more likely destroying it. And it was only a few years later, still in the 1890s, that another painter of the time, the Italian Boldini, ended up painting Montesquieu in gray. And this is the later portrait by Boldini, which is now at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And here you see again Montesquieu holding a cane, but in this case was a very famous cane, which was believed to have belonged to Louis XV, and that Montesquieu bought from the sale of two of his heroes, who were the great writers and collectors, the Goncourt brothers. And at their sale, Montesquieu buys this specific cane, which he shows here. And critics at the time poked fun at this portrait, saying that here is the Comte de Montesquieu in adoration of his cane. The painting by Whistler remained with Montesquieu. The reason its title was given, the title was given by Whistler of Arrangement in Black and Gold, relates also to the frame. And as I mentioned, the frame was designed by Whistler, and Whistler often designed the frames for his portraits halfway through the completion of the portrait, and he would actually finish painting the portraits, as we know he did in this case, while the portrait was already in the frame. So he very much saw the frame as part of the work of art. And so the arrangement in black and gold refers to both the black of the outfit, black against black in this portrait, but also, of course, to the gold frame. But in 1902, Montesquieu sells the painting, and he sells the painting to an American, to Richard Canfield. Richard Canfield was the owner of gambling houses in America on the East Coast, very rich, wealthy man, who became very interested in Whistler and started collecting works by Whistler. Here he is in an unfinished portrait that Whistler did of him in the 19-teens. And at that point, in the early 1900s, and at that point, Canfield was the second largest collector of Whistler paintings. And the first one, of course, was Freer. So two Americans between the end of the 19th century and the early 20th assembled this grand collections of Whistler works back in America. And it is interesting that an American artist active in Europe, working for a European public, effectively then ends up being collected in depth by wealthy Americans at the time. Canfield buys the Montesquieu portrait from Montesquieu in 1902, just before Whistler dies a year later. And this infuriates Whistler. The correspondence between Whistler before he dies and Montesquieu is very strong, very heavy, especially on the part of Whistler, because Montesquieu had promised Whistler that he was going to keep this work for the whole of his life, and he was actually going to bequeath it to the Louvre. And Whistler had this idea that this picture was going to end up in the Louvre. And of course, the fact that the picture instead ended up in the hands of an American collector, someone who Whistler admired and had sold works to, but who at the same time was bringing the work outside of Europe and clearly not getting the work to end up in a prominent museum like the Louvre. Whistler dies in 1903, and Canfield keeps the work until just before he dies in 1914. And just a few months before he dies, he sells a number of his Whistlers to dealers, to Knoedler, for a vast amount of money at the time. And Frick buys three of them, the two black portraits, the portrait of Rosa Corder and the portrait of Montesquieu, and the landscape, beginning his collection of Whistler portraits. The two portraits in pink will be added later in the 19-teens. And all of the portraits are displayed at 1 East 70th Street, which of course is the house in which Frick is moving with his family around this time in 1914, 1915. And they're displayed in Frick's private office. And here you see a photograph from the 1920s showing the two portraits in pink, flanking the fireplace and the Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington. Fascinating to think that all of the American works that Frick collects end up in his office at the house. They move around, and at some point, the Montesquieu portrait is actually mentioned upstairs on the landing, so clearly the portraits were moved to some degree in the house. And this room, the office, the private office of Frick, doesn't actually exist anymore because it was demolished in the 1930s to make space for what is today the Oval Room. So even though they are technically displayed on the same site in the museum, it is a very different space. And the Oval Room, even though, again, it was created originally with the idea of being a sculpture gallery, has had the Whistlers in it from the 1930s onwards. And that, of course, when we will be back at the house, is where you will be able to see the Whistlers once again. One of the great scholars of Whistler, and especially of the Comte de Montesquieu portrait, was one of my predecessors, Edgar Munhall. And Edgar was the first chief curator at the Frick, And so much of what we do today at the Frick is indebted to what Edgar created in terms of foundations. He managed the first catalogs of the collection, the first scholarly ones in the 1960s, and he remained a very active figure at the Frick until his death in 2016, and he is still very, very missed by, much missed by all of us. So I would like to dedicate this episode to Edgar's memory, because he was the man who, between 1995 and 96, curated a marvelous exhibition around the Montesquieu portrait, bringing together a number of portraits of Montesquieu. He was supposedly portrayed more than 55 times, and a number of documents and objects that belonged to him, doing huge amounts of research on Montesquieu. And this is a drawing I particularly love from one of Edgar's diaries, showing Edgar holding the Comte de Montesquieu as he's traveling in search of documents on Montesquieu in September 1993. And of course, at the bottom, you also see Edgar's typical notes on menus and food that he would eat during the day or on his travels. So a lot of the research, obviously, most of the research on Montesquieu is still in Edgar's book that was published in 1995, The Bat and the Butterfly, which I encourage you all to read if you're interested in this portrait. But this is also to say that so much of what we've been doing at Cocktails is really thanks to many of the people that came before us, curators, researchers, fellows at the Frick Collection, who studied these works. And of course, our knowledge on them is building up and continues to build up as we go along. There are many people that I should like to thank, and many people at the Frick Collection have been helping out with Cocktails as a Curator in a number of ways. Of course, my colleagues Amy and Giulio have been wonderful travel companions through this adventure, but many people in a number of departments at the Frick, too many to name this evening, have made this program possible. So thank you to all of them. They know who they are, and they know how grateful we all are for their support, their technical support in a number of different ways, for helping assemble some of the material, for helping in a number of innumerable ways. As they say, it takes a village, and Amy, Julia, and I could have not done it without all the other people who helped out. And of course, we couldn't have done it without you, all of you following us and supporting us and being so supportive and enthusiastic about this program. The Frick Collection is an extraordinary museum, and it is an extraordinary collection of works of art. And I hope we've managed to show how art can be important and is important at times of crisis, but in our lives in general. I feel that none of us at the Frick Collection would do the job we do if we didn't believe that. And if we didn't believe that art can enrich, inspire us during our journey on this planet. The Comte de Montesquieu, this eccentric poet, the model of many books, supposedly. He was said to have been the model of A Rebours by Huysmans, a book translated in English as Against Nature, but also he's said to have been a model maybe for Oscar Wilde in The Picture of Dorian Gray, and most famously, of course, the Baron de Charlus in Proust. So a literary figure himself who inspired literature, but who inspired artists. And the same way that Montesquieu inspired Whistler for this portrait, the portrait can inspire us today. Very famously, as Montesquieu was sitting for this portrait, Whistler looked at him and said, "Look at me for an instant, and you will look forever." And this idea of capturing art, capturing lives, capturing stories, is something that we've been thinking about and presenting through these episodes. And of course, Montesquieu and Whistler live forever through this work and through its presentation at the Frick. I know that Whistler was very disappointed. The portrait did not end up at the Louvre, but I hope he will be happy that it ended up in his native America at the Frick Collection. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you will all follow us and plenty more online and in-person programs coming from the Frick Collection in the future. So follow our website, keep in touch with us, and we will all let you know about new programs through the summer and beginning in the fall, both at Frick Madison and then back at 1 East 70th Street, but also online. Thank you.